Capillaries of Biopower, Race and Sexuality in the Discourse on State, Population, Individual Rights, and State Violence by Soteria Theoharis. Medicalization is a social force. It depends on state definition of health, rights, and abuse of individual and populations, that is, state biopower. As a force, medicalization has a very negative enunciation with the rise of the eugenic movements and Nazi abuses of medical science in the name of defining lives worth living. These abuses were an effect of a particular kind of political climate and state-sanctioned violence. In such moments, medicalization as a social force and violence has defined the population through the deployment of concepts such as race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. These concepts were promulgated on the basis of biomythology of superiority, a white over black, Aryan over Jew, woman over man, straight over homosexual, gender normal over gender queer. This biomythology was grounded in racist, classist, and sexist violence. Biopower inevitably leads to bioresistance, that is, the challenging of the ideological deployment of science in the name of political ends. In a sense, we need to curtail the scope of state has over medicine's means and its ends, as well as the parameter of state action. Introduction. Biopower manifests in how the state deploys race through racialization. Race in the hands of the state becomes racist in certain moments. The deployment of race becomes evident in the building of modern nations with the emergence of discourse on human sciences, where national collectives became biological collectives, not just dependent on language and culture. The state use of biopower became also evident in the emergent sex-gender system. The system became reified through the kinds of sexualities appropriated for the reproduction of certain kinds of racialized bodies. Biopower first appears in Foucault's work, The History of Sexuality. It prefigures such terms as biopolitics, which Foucault also uses, and what I would call bioresistance. These terms underscore the central nature and problematic of life in the decisions over power and politics in modern states. Biopower marks the shift from a sovereign juridical discursive model of power to take life and let live. It grounds in an instrumental rationality which merges with the national action state and its structure of governance. This rationality assumes the plural tasks and programs and strategies of governing. It focuses on investing in the health and longevity and productivity of bodies and populations. Paradoxically, in the mid-20th century, state biopower articulated notions of health and had racist and sexist implications in the managing of life. In analyzing the racist and sexist connotations of biopower in the domain of health, I hope to better demarcate and understand Foucault's formulation to stretch out what modes of embattlement took hold over bodies and populations which granted eugenic policies to convey how modern state practice discourses became invested in further governing and administering life. They encompass a new ethic grounded in discourse on human and civil rights. The rules around the use of knowledge about life became even more contested with biotechnologies. They raised the issues of regulating genes with the addition of new reproductive technologies. In our new millennium tales, genes became powerful nodes. They condensed the problematics of life and blood through notions of lineage and ancestry. A new kind of meritocracy emerged. This meritocracy took hold of the body in more profound ways and participates in the betterment through the purposes of advancement, competition, and Earth's survival. Race, sex as biopolitics of scale. I argue that the relationship between health and biopower filters through the deployment of race and sex as quasi-biological entities. Race and sex have permeated our understandings of differential susceptibility to disease. They became anchoring points. At times, they became causes of or frameworks for the understanding of physicality of disease. At times, they were grounds for developing state tactics and strategies to maintain and invest in health of populations, such as these tactics had as first basis in scientific fact. By augmenting the scope of medical influence, the medical problematizing of health, both on a level of population and the level of individual body, endowed the state with benefic intentions, but also potentially malefic aims. In pursuing its interests, it became entwined in politics of scale, large and small, and it became the central nexus of agency over life and health. State power over life required the disciplining of bodies, the regulation of population, and a medical regimentation of health, and the development of scientific discourses and practice that invested in understanding and safeguarding life at minimum deciding who lives. Modern state power, with its calculating rationality and its microphysics of application, assumed the task of dividing and organizing the expertise and labors of health, constructing appropriate institutions to administer life by defining, managing, and treating illnesses, cultivating specialized knowledges and technologies that would ensure the state's grip on health and as a result in the extension of life. And fourth, differentially distributing the responsibilities of monitoring, inventing, and investing in health, growth, longevity, productivity of populations and bodies. To understand biopower, the problematics of bodies and populations, and the interconnections of state and science as they were expressed through the strategies, tactics, and programs of physicians and state officials granted in discourses, practices, and technologies of self-health need to be explored. Medicalization is a very successful strategy of state biopower. It instrumentalizes medical knowledge for state ends. It also allows a separation between organic and social problems or times of a crossing of a boundary from one direction to the next. Medicalization becomes a force in the interface between structures of power where here is vested with the authority and responsibility to intervene in the face of illness, and health. As a force, it allows us to visualize the micro and macro workings of biopower. Medicalization is the most centrally not the only mode through which the state articulates biopower. Humanitarian efforts could be another example. Sovereign powers were certainly the old model of direct power, where employing power meant life lost, body torture, wars waged. The sovereign powers are still seen as powers of the democratic state through their play must be in check by laws. Terror again is sovereign state power around enough to take life for life in the name and aims specific groups and ideologies. Terror is a retroactive force where ideas and actions become the instruments of death in the name of vindication or honor. Terror holds peace hostage. Wars hold the world hostage. To some extent, gender and race terrorizing has served to police boundaries between groups and to establish a differential of power. Sex, violence, and pornography are two forms which illustrate the point, though not unequivocally. The actions of individuals and collectives establish relationships between groups and personal identities. The actions, rather than official actions of state, define unwritten parameters for existence, though the state may run amok and employ legal tactics to its ends. Two examples of the state holding the people hostage on the grounds of race and sex, sexuality, were the Nazi state and the eugenic movement that took hold of some of the Western and Eastern governments. I will sketch how medicine problematized health and illness in the middle to late 20th century to begin to construct medically manageable diseases. These constructions had social implications and were focused along the axis of race, racism, sex, sexuality, sexism. Then I analyzed historical deployment of medicalized notions of race and sex health in the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi German state. I would juxtapose it to the current constitution of Black health at the same time in the U.S. South. By concentrating on the negative articulation of biopower, I hope to probe the question of scale and scope. What is an appropriate level of state intervention in articulation of biopower? How can we articulate instances where new knowledges and local global strategies curtail negative appropriation of technical science? How can the 20th century process of medicalization be understood and governed? Is biopower totalizing and globalizing? Is it anti-human, even if it's clothed in humanist rhetoric? Is it local or diffused? Is it clear picture of the application necessary in a new kind of bioethics? In this vein, I hope to open a space of inquiry to provide initial questions that can lead further to theoretical investigations. Bioresistance. In the mid-20th century, biopower had been central in totalizing and at times globalizing. To question and challenge this reading, I would juxtapose it to the notion of bioresistance. That is, the tendency for modern and latent social movements to be grounded in opposition to medical modes of social control, power, and the constitutional bodies, to see medicine as an instrument of the state and an instrument of capital. These bioresistances are visible within the doctor-patient interactions at the level of medical policy. I grapple with the continuing reconstitution of collective rights and violences as an effect of medicalization and demedicalization. I took the responsibility of Jewish and Black physicians denouncing in Southern situations the role of physicians in class and occupation based U.S. minors and the U.S. women's movement, hoping to illustrate how biopower structures bioresistance, how the leader manages to mobilize the former. In this essay, I want to avoid the trap of this sharp distinction between expert and lay notions of race and sex. I want to make sure that invisible the efforts of the scientific community to purge itself from ways that suppose folk ideas of race and sex had come to define how human population and individual behaviors were understood as effects of bad science. Error in the deployment of scientific error as fact matters and reflects the nature of scientific institutions in each given moment. It is clear to me that both expert and lay notions of race and sex have been pivotal in ways that racism and sexism, along with the naturalization, normalization of sexuality, took hold over life. And I seek to demonstrate the very problematic ways that race and sex have been deployed in the historical articulation of biopower. The focal question of my analysis include: 1. How has health become increasingly defined and problematized by medical expertise, grounded on and contested by quasi-biological notions such as race and sex, and in turn becomes motives for state intervention, or if overextended, requires mobilization for the medicalization? How have medicalized sex and race bodies become affected by and rolled into unjustified state intervention programs and strategies to consolidate and negotiate an extension and exertion of normative forces to favor bodies as symptomatic of the groups they inhabit? How has this collective process become contested? A site where state biopower has been continually consolidated, contested, and invested in the health. And how has it been seen differentially invested? How has it been differentially invested? Race, racism, sexuality, sexism. Race and sex are potent frameworks. They have come to operate on the grounds of notions of good and bad health. What concepts intersect individuals and populations alike? In their deployment, race and sex have affected new logics of governing, that is, the translation of biopolitics into biopower. These concepts are grounded in the biomythology. This biomythology found a fertile ground in social climates where racism, sexism, normative sexualities were taken as facts. Biomythology is a process of transforming belief into an apparent fact that, upon further scrutiny, bears no weight. Such process easily translates statements that appear utterly unscientific to extend without question into medical and biological fact. On one of the means to which this happens is the early closure of debate in the face of action. Another is circumventing and cross-examination by exhibiting The fact as self-evident or not in question. The biomethodologies of racism and sexism were the result of different kind of scientific enterprise, a different class of scientists. For them, race and sex became sites for speculation that would dress up social inequality into nature, therefore not be subject to analysis or proper social intervention, or would be the cause for improper intervention like sterilization, genocide, miscegenation. In this regard, race and sex became to influence notions of individual and population health. Race and sex gender became thereby more pervasive in ordering society. They directly impacted life and bodies in terms of community and expertise. They also structured access to the domain of state power, who had access to power, who did the science, and more, who made the decision. In the case of race, scientific grounding, the biomythology of racial difference eroded with time. Most certainly, the erosion was an effect of social movements that opposed the racialization of social inequity, as well as sheer horror surrounding the racist development of science in Nazi Germany. However, a comeback of race mattered in health differences is on the way. This may not be the bad thing, as it is motivated by the deployment of better outcomes for care. But knowledge is always paradoxical, as it depends on its deployment. The current scientific grounds of race seems to retain some of the evolutionary characteristics. Biological race defines the parameters of an interdependent co-evolutionary relationship between environment and interbreeding in populations over a large stretch of time. Race as a scientific construct is dependent upon framework of naturalized normative breeding sexuality, where in the offspring biological difference materializes race continuous or discontinuous ways. Racialized violence. The ideology of racism produced virulent notions of medicalized or bioscientific race to legitimate its violence. Racism is a distinct modern phenomenon. As a force, racism is the boundaries between groups. This imprinting happens through experience. Even as racism is challenged, it constantly takes new shapes and employs new tools. In a sense, racism produces certain notions of race. Thus, race is a shorthand for, as well as a symbol of a social knowledge system, a way of knowing and looking at the world and of rationalizing its content. In this case, over human beings, in terms that are derived from previous close historical experiences and reflective contemporary social values, relationships, and conditions. The racist deployment of race, strategically demarcating hegemonic and colonial relations between groups, became key. It gave a framework of conception of what were the possible and viable alliances, kinship structures, and family relationships. These questions came to define a modern colonial state grammar. The state became an instrument of this ideology, understanding and the operation of race as an effort to bind and bound human groups in a framework of superiority and inferiority and constructive positive scientific that is legitimate sounding ground for hierarchical hegemonic relations among them is dependent on the ways that sexuality divided and normalized sexual conduct, how the regulation of sexuality, who's said to radiate and exceed group boundary, unsettled, as well as produce the ground of possible breeding couples and family alliances. Through the appearance or normative naturalized sexuality, distinct notions of racial groups became thinkable and intelligible. Regulating sexuality. The modern emergence of race is an analytic framework for thinking about the boundaries between groups. Biological sex is a framework for describing sexuality emerged, and sexual difference emerged. Speculative agency of sex had split humans into two groups and had set them into breeding relationships, male and female, delineating normal and abnormal sexual practices, whereas an effect of naturalized normative heterosexual relationship differentiating between normals and perverts. As Foucault in 1990 notes, sexual conduct had become key under the scrutiny of Christian conventional techniques before the state mechanism were set to govern it. Christian conventionals led to the development of sexuality as an authorized discourse concerned with sexual conduct that was refined by the 19th century to be discursive practice that constituted scientific sexualis. In the grammar of bodies and populations, both race and sex figured modern individuals in groups. If sex split human groups into two relating one to the other, and on the grounds of a normative reading sexuality, race attempted to define and settle the boundaries between human populations, the limits of a potential acceptable kinship alliance, stabilizing the notions of governed populations subject to the notion of state in its new strategies of governmental power. As in horrors of nationalism hit Europe in the mid-20th century, the notion of the chromatic race became challenged in North America. Race as a scientific construct became increasingly immaterial, while sex and its scientific biomythology became increasingly stabilized within biomedical paradigms, chromosomal, and as a biosocial speculative ideal difference. Even if normative gender practices and identities describe sex as a scripted or as disruptive, even if instances of variation, the articulation of sex and human genotype and phenotype became apparent, sex had become indisputably material. I want to make sure that even if the scientific grounding of racial and sexual difference, both behavioral and biological grounds, have been disrupted and problematized as a source of good and bad health, the potency of racism and sexism affected through practices and discourses within institutional, everyday, and scientific, social, political, legal domains is not left unchallenged. Clearly, the race and sex have ordered life through such topologies. Race and sex have also been reified through the use of scientific constructs such as heredity and breeding behavior. Like sex, race has also negotiated modern embodiment of biopower, the life of the individual body and the life of the species, the group, and the nation. In the application of race and sex to social life, biopower can be clarified as a discursive and technological trick of abstracting, situating, extending, and scaling particular lived differences and experiences of health and illnesses to define and characterize both individual bodies and whole groups. The problematics embedded and embodied in constituting sex, sexism, sexuality, or racism as the grounds of ourselves becomes evident as we doubt what seems to have become to matter in us as identity and about us as history. In other words, we now question how and why we have come to acquire, through what Foucault terms the strategies of sex, which included the medicines of perversions and the programs of eugenics, such an evidently marked, visible, and identifiable body that is race and sex and placing an agonistic field of power relations, social and historical struggles. Notions of race and sex have also rearticulated class dynamics as effects of nature and biology. In analyzing health, class needs to be understood not only as an issue of access to resources that could help keep one healthy, but also as an issue of mobility and freedom. That is the ability to, or power to challenge and extricate oneself from potentially deleterious circumstances. I will delimit the historical problematics embedded in the deployment of race to racism, sexism, and sexuality to see how both race and sex have become grounds upon which the true source of identity is site of resistance, and a promise of freedom is said to be situated. The question, of course, is how to imagine strategies and tactics that can redress the dynamics of the relations between bodies, practices, knowledges, populations, and the institutions that govern them. Even if we agree that with Foucault that modern notions of race and sex are situated at the sites of biopower and as points of conjunctions between the symbolics of blood and the analytics of sexuality, the following questions remain. How have the Western medicalized notions of race and sex been strategically deployed and reproduced within global geopolitics and colonial relations of rule within relations of haves and have-nots? How have technologies of sex produced racism and sexism, racialized and sexed bodies, that are said to be healthy or ill. How can we understand and avert genocidal influences that have historically plagued the articulation of biopower as a modern nightmare, not as an effective, simplistic return of the right to rule by the right to kill, but as an effective power situated and exercising the level of life, the species, the race, and large-scale phenomenon of the population? Granted that I can only begin to address the questions posed, I will focus on the interference between race and sex in attempting to define Foucault's notion of biopower. I will sketch biopower, how it invests in ordering the ways we think about bodies and population in medicine, how state control and social movements interlock and intertwine with medical discourse and practices. In the history of sexuality, Foucault situates state racism at the juncture of the emergence of biopower, the state concerned with life, health, and sexuality. Blood to sexuality. Foucault maps transformation from and between society grounded in the symbolics of blood to the analytics of sexuality, a process that had not been smooth and clean, rather the complex of movements, jolts, interference, and conjoining. Situating the juncture, Foucault gives two examples of the emergence of state racism and psychoanalysis, even though the concept of race is not monolithic in the ways that it has been deployed throughout the world. Its very historical use as a concept illustrates the problematic of biopower in its complex forms. First, let me delineate how Foucault situates the emergence of racism in speaking about Europe. Then I will complexify his account to show that there are striking connections between Europe and North American racist deployments. Race in North America and European context has different trajectories. The difference between race and nation is rather interesting. It shows that with the emergence of the state as central governing apparatus, who has been governed, you needed increasingly more stable definition of clarifications. Figuring race as the grounds of national cohesion seems strategically more important and prevalent in Europe than in North America, where chromatic notions of race seem to take hold. As an effect of and grounded by race and racialized attitudes, the emergence of states mobilized racial discourse to legitimate their actions. In this regard, modern racism in modern biologizing state form became explicit in the whole politics of settlement. Family, marriage, education, social hierarchization, property accompanied by a long series of permanent interventions on the level of the body, conduct, health, and everyday life that received their justification from mythical concern with protecting the purity of the blood and ensuring the triumph of the race. The logic findings must reverse. The expression of eugenic social variety. Eugenics. A Hitler's society of pure-blooded race nation is inextricably linked with the historical constitution of modern nation. Nazi nationalism extended the deployment of sexuality to encompass the former notion of blue-blooded aristocracy under the cloak of natural supremacy and legitimate social heredity. Two racist tactics seem to have been deployed as a means of consolidating boundaries of supremacy between groups. In the U.S. Southern example, laws required the segregation of whites and blacks. In the Nazi example, laws protected healthy Germans from genetically defective Jews, mentally ill people, homosexual, and others. Regulating sexuality became a pretext for segregationist arguments, ascribing sex defects that characterize the subjective group of racist strategies deploying sexuality to stabilize racial boundaries and minimize intermixing. The effect was diminished social interaction between groups, which ultimately facilitated scapegoating. Distinct boundaries between groups were grounded and reinforced in Nazi Germany through the implementation of Nuremberg laws that banned marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Thus, the consolidation of boundaries between racial groups required the deployment of the normative regulation of sexuality. Discourse on the supremacy of one group over another was mostly grounded in biomedical framework of disease and degeneracy, which at times took aberrant sexuality and sexual difference at its target. Racist ideology or rationality became legitimate in the 1930s. The Nazi discourse on the medicalization of anti-Semitism, the view developed by Nazi physicians and Jews were one diseased race, that the Jewish question might be solved by medical means. 19th century medicalization of American racism is a more blatant. Southern form shows that racist notions of disease were not specific to Germany. Medicalization of racism, of course, took different forms depending on the context of situation. For example, the consequences of racism are an issue in both the northern and southern states. But in the South, the blacks were victims of legalized discrimination. Heredity bias. In both Nazi and U.S. Southern deployment of race, the strategy of medicalizing social problems had a hereditary bias. Medicalized racism tried to explain diseases and ill health that were affected by the production of specific conditions of segregation, unemployment, and poverty. These conditions in turn justified and further fueled research and recommendations into further racializing conceptions of health, medicine, and its delivery. Noteworthy is the fact that Nazi movements were popular with German physicians and boasted of a public health effort. Nazi managed to find strategies of caring through health programs while dismantling dissenting voices. The most striking feature of Nazi eugenic movements, in juxtaposed to the rest, was the hereditary bias, their sole emphasis on biology to explain both behaviors, disease, and social problems. The hereditarianism was part of a broader conception of the place of science in society, and that was shared by eugenic movements in other countries. Common to racial hygiene movements throughout the world was the view that biology must be looked to solve social problems. The ordering of health and medicine through racialized conception of health was embedded in racist politics in a system of health delivery that still afflicted us. Unquestionably, the deployment of race in Germany was particularly gruesome, an effect of the consolidation of forces around the notion of destruction of lives not worth living. Despite the humanistic rhetoric surrounding euthanasia as mercy death to patients judged incurably sick by critical medical examinations, ironically, this humanistic mercy killing of the incurably sick was extended. It became a centerpiece of the Nazi solution for handling social problems, including the Jewish question, leading to extensive and aggressive genocidal atrocities in the 20th century. These events were possible only as the power extended itself to the management of the whole social life. Through the comparative deployment of racism in Nazi Germany, the turn of the century in North America, it is clear that sexuality needed to be the sole grounds to which racism is a particular problematic articulation biopower is deployed. However, understanding the hold of the state over sexuality and health is key in understanding how, why, and which bodies did get to have a race and sex and a problematic sexuality. How and why did racial distinctions have been made? To recap, sex intertwined with race in at least two domains, questions of racial distinction and questions of racial superiority. The Nazi claim of supremacy was grounded in notions of better health and it required a normalized sexuality which would protect male virility that might otherwise have been compromised by horrific ambiguities witnessed or thought to be witnessed in Jewish sex gender. As a practice of separation between races was threatened and dependent on the construction of a normative breeding sexuality that prohibited racial intermarriage, this racial separation was grounded in the rejection of certain foreign alien bodies and realized through the most murderous totalizing violence. So far, we have analyzed the totalizing effects of the deployment of race, sex, and made visible the most problematic articulation. The deployment of race and sex is not limited to such totalizing frameworks of biopower. Race and sex as elements in the process of medicalization became central to the exercise of biopower since they ordered, defined, and aligned individual bodies and populations through the deployment as such discursive rationalities and as a complex process so that race and sex was constituted as focal points for the promotion of health, requiring subjection to the medical and state governing apparatus. I have illustrated the historical problematizations that have subjected us to understanding and seeing our bodies through race and sex. Race and sex have become discursive political models through which our bodies came to matter and became intelligent within frameworks of medicalization. What disturbances, resistances, resignifications are implicated in the deployment of race and sex? What blood, tears, pain, sorrow, actions, and movements are incited? What practices, discourses implicate bodies and emotions in the extension and exercise of state control? Are the multiplicities of practices and discourses engaging in making social embodiment, including twin deployment of sex, sexuality, race, racism? How have they rendered the body through modes of effective and efficient power? This ordering of body has been secured as a hold of state apparatus governing a medicalization of life. How is the scaling effect of linking bodies and population necessary as a potency of race, sex, and class? In what instances does the scale effect happen? In what instances is it actively denied? Even in modern deployment of sex and race did take the murders into a lifespan as it purview of the state control was expanded to encompass the whole body of life. Biopower as a process was invested in and emancipated from the interrelation of bodies and populations. It became inherently complex and increasingly open when a freer relationship of engagement was established between who got to know how knowledge was made and who made what decisions about governing life. It is not an accident that, and should be underscored, that medicine was the move through which Nazi destruction of lives not worth living took place, and medical practitioners were operating the gas chambers, exploiting the trust and compliance of their patients. And it's clear that Nazi medicine was authoritarian medicine. Contesting the discourses and practices of medicine has been a difficult task. In the Nazi example, there was a clear marginalization of Jewish physicians who were allowed to publish in medical journals if they had addressed issues concerning Jews as diseased. Some physicians had published work supporting the argument that the Jewish population might be more susceptible to disease, and that the discourse got twisted into supporting and collaborating Nazi ideologies and the fact that Jewish women were involved in masculine professions such as medicine added to the threat. Black physicians struggled to influence policies that affected them. The quality of education, the resources available to the health of the community, the soundness of some of the science on race and health was at stake. They were barred from joining the American Medical Association and were not allowed to publish on the topic of Black American health. In instances, not only were group marginalized and separated from the resources that had impacted life, the process of science making and the resources of contesting medical science and practice were barred to them as well. In terms of class and occupational health, the story of Black lung, the minor's disease, is rather instructive. It shows how and through what social movements the condition of being a minor in the U.S. was acknowledged as a condition that needed compensation. It required the revolution in medical conception of Black lung disease as an effective occupation and required the condensation of government compensation, including social security mechanisms. Black lung is an instance where medicine was used for achieving the needs of the social group, even if the initial medicine was done in a coercive fashion with the mining industry. Preventative measures were not required as a result of Black lung. Social movement is rather troublesome. Also, who got to have Black lung got compensated for horrific work conditions was also subject to medical scrutiny that initially sought to limit the liability of the state and the mining industry. Black lung is a recent example of the kind of social movement around medicalization of disease that was a result of medicalization of social issues as well as the mode of biopower. These are examples of medical bioresistance. Bioresistance had tended to materialize in struggles where most men who were excluded on the grounds of race and class to sought access to governance in the workplace or in challenging scientific sounding explanations of races, classes, occupational, social realities. In such case scenario, the instances are not a victory of right or wrong, rather they illustrate the adaptability of biopower, the way it extends, it recedes, it regroups, and helps raise the question of if it can be democratized. Ethical bioscience. A complex story of barred access to medical knowledge and need of influence in medical practice could be told about women as the other sex beings that also have race and class. The practices of exclusion are explicit and hard to extricate insofar as sex has retained scientific grounds for understanding bodies, especially women's bodies that menstruate, get pregnant, go through menopause, get breast cancer, but also die of heart disease. Being a woman, a medical model was and still is treated like having some kind of form of congenital disease. Opening medical knowledge to women's bodies and not treating them as degenerate versions of male ones were key for struggles. The first result was the recent discovery of fully functioning women bodies in medical research. This Women's Health Project created visibility of women's bodies in medicine required the reallocation of research to study illnesses such as heart disease, which were thought to be human and were only studied on men. Women's health is no longer equated to reproductive health. Visibility, as Foucault has taught us, is rather paradoxical. Remember what happens to the separate but equal delivery system in the context of race. Most certainly, the effect of this visibility would depend on how knowledge on women's bodies gets ratified and deployed in social policy. If opening up medical knowledge and practices to subjected groups has been key strategy in challenging racist, sexist, classist paradigms, could it also extend and or subvert them? Key challenge is to understand the diversity and difference outside of the 19th century relations of supremacy, inferiority, domination, subordination, accompanying colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. Race, class, sex, gender need to be studied in their interlinkages with health and illness. Instantaneous assumptions about the physiological grounding of any of these concepts, however, needs to be bracketed, and the space of studying the ways in which being Black, poor, and or a woman might already place one at risk. Simply opening up the knowledges and practices does not alleviate the totalizing hold of the biomedical framework over social problems. The fact that racism and sexism operate through medical institutions underscores the fact that these institutions may have built-in biases in the who does the work that have racist, classist, sexist implications. The ritualization of medical practice and knowledge making benign sounding terms like risk, trust, responsibility, and support might intend to make it harder to recognize and identify practices are racist, sexist, and classist. I do not have answers to this question, but feel they're important to note them. How can we practically engage with medicine, its knowledge practices, its relation to the state, and its policies? How can we attempt to open a free relation to medicine for the multiplicity of groups subjected to its practices? How can we limit the scope of medicine as it has a tendency to take over contested social domains in totalizing fashion? What practice of freedom can be all constitute as an open relationship to biopower, to medical state governing? How can an organic and free relationship between modes of medical governance, of health and social intelligibility be recognized?